Scaniers. I would like to introduce to you our demo person for today, Matthew Chapman. Matthew is a tech advisor for Trend Micro, a cybersecurity expert with over 25 years in the industry. He has consulted on cybersecurity for many Fortune 500 companies, data centers, cloud solutions, and security operations centers. He's pretty much done everything except create Skynet. Again, I present to you for this demo, Matthew Chapman. Matthew, take it away.
How's everybody doing? So if you don't get the reference by now, or if you're too young to remember, or you just figured out what Cobra Kai is on Netflix, the sweep the leg reference is reference to cheating, basically, in karate, right? So that scene in Karate Kid where he says, I'm going to sweep the leg. I just want to give you a quick presentation on some of these things around IPS, and then we'll move into an actual demo. I'm going to demo a recent threat that probably most of you have heard about. Some of you have probably even played around with the Python script to do the exploit. But if you have any questions as we go, just feel free to ask. And I think Eric's going to round those up to me as we go, so you don't have to wait till the end. There's my Twitter handle if you want to reach out to me on Twitter. I say that, but I also say that my opinions are my own and not my company of Trend Micro. So there you go. Moving on with that. So a couple quotes to start things off. I'm a big quote guy. I think they're teachable moments all the time, but Gartner just put this out late last year. Through 2025, 99% of all cloud security failures will be the customer's fault, which is kind of mean to say in a way, but also accurate in a way of, and not just protection of it, but also the the configurations and so forth, because as more and more customers are moving to the cloud and away from their data centers, the landscape of what they actually have to learn is changing, and what they expect when they go there. If you know who Kevin Mitnick is, world's most famous hacker, mostly because he got caught. Security is always going to be a cat and mouse game, because there'll always be people out there that are hunting for the 0-day award. You have people that don't have configuration management, don't have vulnerability management, and don't have patch management. It's kind of a run-on sentence from Kevin, but basically it just means if you're not doing vulnerability management, or you're not doing any kind of configuration management, and you're not patching your systems, you're going to be vulnerable to the folks that are always hunting for you. So speaking back to that Gartner thing of some things that don't change, even in the days before when you had your own infrastructure and so forth, and a lot of you have probably seen this slide, they're either from Trend or from other vendors. It's the shared responsibility slide. Essentially, here's where we were when we were a data center, and then when we actually go to a cloud provider, we still have stuff we have to maintain. So the cloud provider does regions and infrastructure and things like that, but you're still responsible for your systems and the protection of those systems. So leaving things like configuration management, IPS, and patching, that's on you when you move to the cloud, just like it was on you in the data center. So some of these are IPS related, some of these are not, but this is what's come out to be the top 4 new cloud threat vectors for breaches. And a lot of it is in the DevOps pipeline, because as you move to the cloud, you have issues with, now you're doing actual configuration changes with DevOps pipelines with CI/CD. So those introduce weak links, serverless platforms introducing attack surfaces for vulnerable code. So I like to say this with containers and also the serverless stuff. I tend to see a little bit of this going on, where you've got your guy that you've assigned to go do the work, and he, instead of doing all the work on his own, goes out and grabs maybe a complete repository that's already pre-done, and he thinks, okay, I can just skip some steps here and do this. And then he introduces either vulnerable code into the environment, or even crypto mining, things like that. So you just want to have something to be able to double check that work, if you will. And under misconfigurations, we've got a lot of issues with storage access and secrets management, and just validating your actual cloud conformity scripts and things like that. Just overly permissive access to workloads, especially. So think of your S3 buckets in AWS, or your blob in Azure. Are you really protecting it? Is it not public? Are you only making it accessible to the application that needs it? Things like that are main misconfigurations that need to be audited on a regular basis. Eric, is that a question already over there? All right. When you apply your security controls matter, so reduction of cost versus workflow. So this may look weird and confusing at first, but basically it's only a 1x if you put your security controls when you're in the planning stage of your deployments. If you wait till you're in the run stage, it costs you 30 times more to apply your security controls, because it's kind of like too little too late. So again, this is putting security at the forefront of your product and your actual deployments rather than at the end thought. So putting that in the workflow early is the best stage. And we all know the secret, right? Like when there is a breach, they want to throw money at you. When there's no breach, it's trying to get money is hard. So things like this, where it's a true NIST planning report that you can show a boss, or you are the boss and see this, it's very impactful. So stages of a threat. This has some varying differences over time and so forth, depending on the platform. But overall, it's kind of the same way, right? Network and email is still the big place for arrival. But if you look as we go through, we still have to the disk, it comes in, hits the disk, it has execution phases and it has exfiltration phases. But in each one of these phases, we have to have something that can attack that actual threat. So entry points, obviously, you've got your firewall, IPS, and web rep. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because a lot of this is specific things for us, but also, I would say recommendations at each one of these levels. So it kind of oversees all these pieces. If you look at anything when it goes into execution, now we're in a runtime place. You've got your behavior analysis and application control, so you can lock things down, and your ransomware protection. And exfiltration, when you have command and controls, protection is good. You want to do anything that can keep it from encrypting and causing a ransomware scenario. And then when you have all these things working in your favor, you might get a lot of noise. So something that actually gives you kind of whitelist checking and census checking at the disk and execution phase or pre-execution or runtime phase is very important, so you don't get a lot of false positives. But why I like this slide is because it covers everything, cloud, containers, etc. But if you notice, you've got at least two, maybe even a third place where IPS is important. And it's at arrival and exfiltration. Now, it's also in a place which is not in here, but actually repeats itself when it happens, which is when something does attack you, gets in, camps, and then wants to move laterally, this is where the same process works over again. So that would be like maybe network-based arrival. So there's your IPS protecting you again. Look at, in the past, WannaCry, for example. I mean, it's an older example, but look at WannaCry. For folks that even had good AV protection, but maybe it had a couple machines that didn't have the AV protection on or not with all the features turned on, and they did get infected, when that actual binary was trying to go out and land and expand, if you will, by exploiting the SMBv1 protocol exploit, it could jump around the network and find other machines that didn't have the proper patch level or the proper settings on their malware protection. So if you had a good host-based IPS running, you would stop WannaCry from that lateral movement at that point. So kind of another way to look at this, you have pre-deployment. So think of that as like image scanning and stuff that's maybe in your containers and so forth, your repositories. You have things where you can do vulnerability scanning. These are things that you can do to help protect yourself as you're watching those images. Sweeping, hunting, EDR, XDR, you guys have probably already heard all of that stuff. From the network side, there again, you have intrusion prevention. And you do still have vulnerability protection, so you're covering both sides. So this is still where the IPS is very important. And throughout the entire process, but this gives you some pieces and parts of what you might actually benefit from as a piece, or say a module, whatever vendor you choose, what you should be looking for at each level here, from a system perspective, a network perspective, etc. Any questions so far? So even when we're looking at, I get this question a lot actually. So I've put up a Docker or container, right? And I'm running an application inside that container on my host. I have host OS protection, but I don't have IPS protection. Do I have, or do I need IPS protection for that container? And I would say, yeah, I mean, it carries over. So protecting the host at the host level is different than protecting the application on the Docker level, because the application may be running, in this example, let's say Nginx, maybe Nginx is running an older version that's actually vulnerable, but the host doesn't have anything vulnerable. If that IPS is not Docker aware or container aware, it's not going to know that that actual engine or application running inside the Docker engine or Kubernetes engine is vulnerable, and it won't be able to protect the the pathway, if you will, between the container and the host. So, or even container to container. So it's very important to have something, if it's not the same product, at least something that does still protect that container if it's going to be a container that stays up for any length of time. So I'm going to get this question probably, why am I talking about ransomware? Well, the reason why I'm going to talk a little bit about ransomware for an IPS conversation is, again, just like with the WannaCry piece, we're seeing with other things where you enter the network through an exploit, which would have been prevented with a good IPS, a known exploit, and then you place your ransomware in camp, and then you execute the encryption, and you start asking for money. So there's a lot of examples right now where we're seeing this happen, and also let's see a little stat here for that one. Yeah, so the business victim every 14 seconds was last year's statistic. The Herjavec group just updated that with a thought that it will be 11 seconds. I know it's only a 3-second difference, but next year will be business victim every 11 seconds of ransomware. So this here shows you year over year how it's increasing as far as how much it's costing, right? But you see on the right side the average request. So the average request over time is also increasing, an almost identical path. So 2020 so far, the average ask of a ransomware encryption when it hits that desktop is $8,100. So when you don't have an IPS and you suffer a breach, how much does it cost you really? So cybercrime has cost businesses over $2 trillion in 2019 and projected to hit $6 trillion next year. Healthcare has been the most expensive at $6.45 million a breach, where the global average cost is $3.9 million. But the US, where we like to sit here, is $8.19 million as an average. So breaches can get expensive. So when you're looking at that budget and saying, do I need to buy something or not buy something to protect myself? Is it worth it? Yeah, it's worth it in the long run and in the short run. So I'm going to demonstrate Zerologon, which is CVE 2020-1472. The patch was available from Microsoft in August. Essentially, to high level, it's the attacker can zero out your admin account from your domain controller, basically causing a couple different handshake methods and adding a couple zeros. It's able to trick it and then just null byte the entire, or null and void the actual password, which gives them complete access to your system. You can also pull down the hash code or SHA or hash of all of the actual users attached to that system, and that can take a long time. But if you haven't heard of the Mercury hacker group, they are now actively exploiting it and using it to drop ransomware inside your environment, hence the comments about ransomware earlier. The exploits and the POCs are all over the net. There's varying degrees of it. There's some that just actually check for the vulnerability. There's some that check for the vulnerability, then if it is vulnerable, will zero out the password for the admin, put your own password in there, and then back it back out if you want it to. So just changing the code a little bit, you can mess with things. So any script kiddie right now that can run Python on their Linux box or even their Windows box can basically wreak havoc on a domain controller that's not protected. And this affected, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 2008 R2 all the way to 2019. Microsoft has issued some statements that they're seeing a lot from especially from the Mercury hack group, that they're acting like, update servers, and they're pushing the updates over to them as if it's something to do with the patch when it's not, which is just furthering the exploit and dropping it. They're also using, as this example here puts, they're looking at ways to get into those networks, knowing that there's probably domain controllers that are not patched, because domain controllers generally stay up longer, and hence, hey, I haven't patched it in a long time, so because it requires a reboot. So they will look for other things that are open, maybe your SharePoint server, maybe an Exchange server, something that they can exploit code on that gets them inside so they can camp and move forward and laterally. So these are some of the things you need to worry about when you're not patching on an off and off basis. So the famous words are patch now and patch often, test and test often. But the problem with that is this, right? That software update requires me to restart. So you tend to not do it, or you put it off. And then here we are months later, and we're talking about Zerologon, or whatever the flavor of the day is, because it's something to do with a patch that probably was available, but we're just not patching enough. So how do we cheat the system? I'd say that, this is where I get the term from, because we have to cheat, right? We have to basically cheat the system. And by cheating the system, I mean, well, I can't patch that machine. It has to be up all the time. So how do I deal with that machine that has to be up all the time? It's on a configuration management of maybe once a month or once a quarter, and we're behind, and now this big vulnerability is out there. Well, the answer would be IPS. So if you have an IPS system that gives you good, as we quote unquote say, virtual patching, protects you from the vulnerability without actually physically patching the box, then it's easy to move forward and not really worry too much about it for now, right? I mean, it doesn't give you usually the warm and fuzzies you get to go to sleep at night, but you do want to get to a point where you do patch that box. Or obviously maybe you have two servers running the same service. You can take one down, you do a true blue, green, or dev, dev QA command control there. So you're good to go. But if you can't, and you're really trying to make sure you're good, it's really, really important nowadays to have that good host-based IPS. So let me just see if I can stop this share. I'm going to stop that temporarily. I'm going to show you the actual demo now. Just give me 1 sec, guys. Okay, so what I have here real quick is I've got our workload security. We have a great IPS system, but I'm not here to pitch our stuff. So I'm just saying, get a good host-based IPS. If you look on the right side of the screen, you're going to see a Windows 2012 R2 server. This is purposely called my victim server. It doesn't have any patches on it. It's like it was just built brand new in 2012. It doesn't call home. Microsoft is pretty good about yelling at me regularly about it to try to get me call home for updates. I have our deep security, also known as workload security software, running on it. You can see the IP address is 192.168.1.65. Now, it does say that intrusion prevention is running, but over here you'll see that computer is my domain controller. It is running, but the way that I have it running in our setup is I have the IPS turned on to detect. So it's going to detect it, but it's not going to do anything about it. And for the folks that go, well, I don't want to run an IPS because I get a lot of false positives, this is where you can set up an IPS, run it in detect mode like an IDS, see what kind of logs you generate, see if any of your applications or custom homegrown stuff is flagging the IPS that you have to go worry about. And if not, then you're pretty safe to move forward. One of the overarching benefits of this particular IPS and why you see so many rules applied, 991, is because it scans itself to see what software is on the machine and what software is vulnerable. And it only applies those rules that are needed, so you don't actually have to put a whole bunch of stuff in memory. Like, there's no reason for a Windows box to be worried about Linux applications as a whole. You don't have to shoehorn all of the IPS rules in here that you'd probably take over from, say, a network IPS to cover your host. This host is only worried about the current posture that it's in at the moment. If you go and patch Zerologon tomorrow morning, and then this thing runs a recommendation scan, it's going to remove those rules for Zerologon because you've patched it. So we're in detect mode. Here's our Windows server. Here's my go mess with your life machine pen tester. So I have the Python script ready to go. It asks for a couple of things. I've modified this script a little bit to where it just does one of two things. It doesn't actually break my machine or pull down any hash values of any of the actual usernames and passwords. It doesn't zero them out either. What it does like to do is just kind of like a Metasploit test, if you will. I think this will end up being part of the code that gets added to the Metasploit code base for this. Essentially, it is going to pass the domain controller name and IP address. It's going to establish the handshakes and sessions to see if it is vulnerable, to see if the answer is in a vulnerable state. But right before it actually goes into exploiting it, the vulnerability, it cuts off. So I've changed the script so I don't mess up my machine too much, and I can actually continue further with the demo. So you should see a bunch of, I believe it's equal signs going across if it's working. And then if the system is either patched or is protected with a virtual patch like an IPS exploitation rule, then what will happen is it'll break the script. So there you go. So it can be fully compromised by a Zerologon attack. Easy as that. So in that amount of time that you saw that run is about how fast So in that amount of time, it could have actually performed the full attack and taken over your domain controller and thusly ruined the rest of your weekend probably. So I'm gonna go back over here. I'm gonna change this rule back to prevent. And while I'm waiting for that to go over, I'll show you what it looks like when you actually see the attack on this side. So here's the net log on elevation. So it's trying to elevate the privileges. So you'll get a couple things in ours particularly. You'll get similar stuff in other products as well that do the same thing. Here's your actual, it happened, and here's a reset that happened, and then here's actual data, right? So if you look at both of these, you'll see, you'll get some really good information as to who tried to attack you. And if you look at the next one, you'll actually get even more information, not just the who attacked you and so forth, and the process name they tried to execute against, which is obviously authentication. You'll get data. So you can break this down. So you'll see a lot of, you can actually see some of the code it's actually trying to go against. There's a couple times where you'll see data where it'll literally be, say, like an injection against a web server. And the data piece you'll get is where it flagged the bit for what we detected in the exploit for the injection. So you'll see actual some of the code being used. You'll even see like a lot of SQL injectors will actually just use bypass websites where they actually load the website up and then pass it over to you to force the injection that way. And you'll actually see the whole string in there and whatever they wanted to inject into the data, and it gets blocked. So pretty interesting there. I think this has probably had time to go over. So we'll try it again. It should either break or not break. The policy's over, and it broke. So this is it trying to get over, and it actually saying, nope, you're not going to hit my box. I'm actually not vulnerable, or in this case, I am vulnerable, but you don't know any better. And then in a few minutes, you'll see this thing show up here actually in the prevented place. So that's kind of just a good demo of how that elevation of privilege works and how easy it is to defend against it once you have a good IPS in place. I do see, Eric, I do see some questions in the QA.
Well, one person was just thanking you for your expertise, but the next question is, what are some of the most common issues customers have with deploying host-based IPS, and how do you work around those issues?
I would say, I kind of touched on a little bit, but I would say most of the time it's homegrown applications that may have code in it that comes up as vulnerable, but you need to, basically put the exception in. I've also seen where things that are a bit too chatty, like maybe CCTV stuff or things like that, that talk back to a main server on a regular basis of a stream. Certain at least IPSs, not this one in particular, will see that as a network attack and put it into the basically constant reset, and then you don't have any access to your server. But I think if you actually start with the recommended method I have, which is to say, let it do its load, let it figure out what it needs to protect, and put it in detect mode, and let it run for a little bit. Give it some time, almost like you would a dev or prod environment changeover, and just watch what it does. See how it interacts. Look at those logs. Pull them out of your SIM if you have them pointing to your SIM, and then go, okay, these look legit, or these look like this is really having a problem with a specific application we have. How do we set this up to prevent without actually breaking that? So that's what I would say. Treat it like a true dev prod by putting in the detect first.
Got it. Okay. I think that's all that we have for right now.
I went really fast. Apologize for that. I did want to say one thing. We do have a booth here, and I believe we are giving away. I don't know. I think it's an Apple Watch. I'm not sure, but if you stop by the booth, have a little conversation. I think you have to sign up for a health check, which we would do for free. We'd be able to sit down. You have someone like me to help you out, and from there you can actually, from just signing up for that, actually get put in a raffle. We've got a lot of guys over at the booth. I'll be at the booth a little bit later. So we have people at the booth that can deal with cloud questions, data center questions, any kind of security questions you might have, endpoint, DevOps stuff, IoT even, which I think is the next big thing at this moment. But yeah.
Okay, we have one more question.
Okay.
Let's see. Does Trend Micro have a way of validating homegrown apps so they do not trigger?
Validating the homegrown apps. So I say the homegrown apps piece because I've seen it happen before. It generally flags under the malware engine for like behavior monitoring because it acts differently. Those are generally where those happen, not generally the IPS. When it's the IPS, I would say it's more of, and I hate to use this example, but I will. So let's say you have an application that requires struts, right? The application may be fine, but the struts it's talking to is vulnerable, right? And then you don't get blocked per se from the IPS, but someone attempting to exploit you because of that struts vulnerability would be getting blocked. So essentially, you're not blocking the service. You're not blocking any access to the service. You're blocking the user's access to it that was doing an exploit per se. So you don't get a lot of false positives with the IPS simply because it's looking in the code to see if there's something that is being exploited that it already is vulnerable. So there's true, like, I'm using Metasploit or a custom Python script that has the exploit code in it. It's looking for that data stream that's exploitable. It's not actually looking to your application to see if your application is anything different or behaving weirdly. So I would say most of the time from homegrown stuff, it's going to be the behavior monitoring engine that you have to put an exception in for. If that makes sense. And if that didn't answer your question the way you wanted to answer it, just let me know. Or yell at me on Twitter.
No one ever yells on Twitter.
No one ever yells on Twitter. No, never. Never happens.
Right. That's what Facebook's for. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then no other questions?
I think that was it.
Oh, okay. You got another one. Can you talk about the virtual patching in more detail as well? How has that impacted your customers' patch cycles?
So a little more in detail with the virtual patching. So for us, we get our information because we have a thing called ZDI, Zero Day Initiative. So Zero Day Initiative was brought over from Tipping Point with that purchase. And essentially it's the biggest bug bounty program in the world. We actually have, I think it's above 65% of all CVEs you see were detected or paid for by us. So we have a very large swath of knowledge when it comes to preventing things with IPSs and looking at that exploit code. So how does it affect your patching cycle? When we see that, when we've been given the vulnerability and we've alerted the actual vendor, the vendor has 60 days basically to get their patch out there. But already by then, we've got rules in place that we're putting on our network-based IPSs, and we're already working toward releasing them on day one of the patch as well for things like the Cloud One workload security and even our endpoint for the host-based IPS on the workstations. So it impacts our customers' patch cycles because they can wait longer because they have that protection. So day one, they already have that protection and they're able to say, well, I could patch today or I could wait a little bit longer, but at least I'm already patched now, right? So if you have it even before the release, even better, right? So it's a win-win. We typically see some customers go longer, maybe 30 days or so, but I've seen customers that they've got servers, they just won't reboot, but eventually they have to. So they'll go to like what you see with that 2012 server, 900 some odd rules protecting that box, right? But yep. Makes it a little bit longer for you. Makes it easier for you.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, that answered that question. Anyone else? Okay, I just want to remind everybody about the booths that are going on from 11 to 12:30 and 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. So I believe there's some questions and stuff like that you can answer that actually can get you a $25 Amazon gift card after the raffle. So feel free to join that. We also have the lounge area where you can have more in-depth conversation or meet up with people as well. Matthew, you have anything else for us?
Nope. Like I said, I would probably be under the hour, but I just want to make sure you guys saw something live. Too many things here or too many things everywhere I see is like, PowerPoint, PowerPoint, PowerPoint. So I wanted to make sure you guys saw a working example of something that's in the news today. And please patch your systems. And if you don't, put a good host-based IPS on for now.
Okay. So with the patching,
Mm-hmm.
I understand that there's a lot that entails because there's a level of testing and just the process that each individual company should go through before they even um, roll out those patches into their infrastructure. Um, are there any ways to kind of cut down on that time that you could think of as far as going through which patches are viable or needed for each individual company?
Yeah, it's good, actually a good question. But it's not so much which ones are viable. I think more of even when you just roll up all the Microsoft patches on your Windows server, you might break something that you've written or some web page you have running on the server or some application that's maybe not verified with the new change or the DLL they updated. So there's no end to the possibilities of things you may break unintentionally, which is why people wait to patch, and they also wait to keep the server from being offline. I think having a good dev to prod, two systems that look identical in the cycle to where you can say, this is the dev box, the patch Tuesday from Microsoft came out. Let's run the patches, see how it affects the dev box, make sure all the applications that we're running on that box still work correctly. And then you can roll the patches to prod. So you have a true change management process where you have a true, they call it cloud, it was blue-green, right? But in data centers, it was more of a dev prod type of scenario. But just so you have some way of verifying that what you're doing is actually going to work. I do see one thing that doesn't get brought up enough, which is the longer you wait in a patch cycle, if you keep going and going and going, I mean, patch Tuesday might end up being 35 patches from Microsoft, right? So you wait one patch Tuesday, one or two, three, four down the road, you may be up to 80 things. Now you're tracking 80, 90 patches you have to deal with versus that first 10 or 15 that you could have done a while ago that maybe
Right.
pack, right? So it's just a compounding issue where if you don't start doing it earlier, you end up with more stuff to worry about. And like the previous question, with this, we end up seeing customers that take advantage of this technology saying, I can just go longer and longer. Sure, you can, but we still encourage you to patch your systems, right? That's still the best scenario. And you want to limit how many rules you have running in the first place. So it's better to get that patch done correctly and then still look and see if the system needs to be protected from something else. There's going to be plenty of things that we're still going to have to protect you from. So yeah, having a good rotation is the way to go.
Okay, sounds good. All right, are there any other questions for our expert, short of Skynet determining clinician we have here? Okay, well, we're going to keep this open because our next session will start at 11:30. But in the meantime, if anybody wants to go out to the lobby to meet up with some other people or check some of the other displays that are going on, feel free. And we'll be back here at 11:30. I want to thank Matt for his contribution, for everything he's put in, his expertise, and we'll be seeing him again shortly.
Eric?
All right, let me go ahead and pause.
That's the code. Mouse might go there. It's probably gibberish, but it's just showing it didn't take a lot. You know what I mean?
Right.
And what this much of it right here is just the answer.
Oh, wow.
You know, like if it did work or didn't work, print attack failed or didn't, you know, whatever, or you didn't put in the code correctly. So just probably from yeah, from here up is the actual code to do it.
Wow.
Yeah. And all I changed was I just didn't want it to break my machine, you know. So I'd have to be resetting the VM every time. I didn't want to have to do that.
We're recording now. Okay, everybody. You are attending the Sweeping the Leg with IPS Trend Micro. I am Eric Scanius, your moderator for this demo coming from the dungeons of InfoSecon. I would like to introduce to you Matthew Chapman. Matthew is a tech advisor for Trend Micro, cybersecurity expert for over 25 years in the industry. He has consulted on cybersecurity instances for many Fortune 500 companies, data centers, cloud solutions, security operations centers. I mean, he's done everything except create Legion and the Terminators. Again, I present to you for this demo, Matthew Chapman. Take it away, Dad.
All right, looks like there's a couple of us here, probably a few more coming in, but I will go ahead and get started sharing this big screen. So I'm going to share a whole screen, go back and forth a little bit. So it's not a level of unprofessionalism. It's just I got to open up a couple windows to do this, right? And Eric, is it still okay? The questions come directly to you in the box and we can go as we go? Okay.
That'll be fine. Yeah.
All right. No worries. So as Eric said, I am Matthew Chapman. I'm a technical advisor with Trend Micro, certified on pretty much every one of the products, including the tipping point products. If you have any specific questions about any of that stuff, workload security, anything Cloud One, you will see there my Twitter handle if you want to go yell at me on Twitter. But also know that anything you see there is actually me posting my own personal beliefs and opinions, nothing to do associated with the company. And as you can see by now, if you haven't caught the gist of it, it's a Cobra Kai themed presentation. Sweeping the leg being the cheat that was done to win the first tournament. So a couple quotes. I love quotes. Through 2025, 99% of cloud security failures will be the customer's fault. That was by Gardner of last year. It's nice of them to blame the customer, but that is the truth. I mean, misconfigurations and not understanding what you're deploying, especially as you move from maybe a data center centric view of the world to a cloud centric view. A lot of those features and functions and things that you've learned do carry over, but some don't. So you do have to maybe learn some new things, and those cause configuration errors if you don't pay attention. And that's where you can fall through the cracks a little bit. So old quote by Kevin Mitnick here, which is applicable to this presentation. Security is always going to be a cat and mouse game because there will be people out there that are hunting for zero-day awards. You have people that don't have configuration management, vulnerability management, and patch management. So to speak to that, more succinctly, it's basically the idea that you have to patch your systems is very paramount. So in lieu of patching, we have some things we can do to mitigate the time in between. And that's what we call virtual patching, which is something I'll be discussing in just a little bit, which it centers around the IPS technology. So this was traditional way you looked at the world when you had a data center. You had you were responsible for everything. And some of you have probably seen this. If you've ever seen a Trend Micro slide before, you've probably seen this recently in the last couple of years, but this is the whole shared access, shared actual responsibility. So what does the cloud provider provide? What does the customer provide? Before you did everything, now the cloud provider does the base foundation services and global infrastructure. The difference is a lot of customers I've talked to still have this misnomer in their mind that, oh, I've moved to the cloud. I don't have anything to worry about. I just push the button and start the Windows server. Everything's taken care of from there on. And the fact of the matter, that's not true. You still have the encryption issues to deal with, software updates to deal with. All AWS or Azure has provided you with, or Google Cloud has provided you with, is the instance or the VM to run. And some of the network traffic in the back, they're not actually doing anything to protect you there on out, especially with your applications as they move to containers and serverless as well. So sort of related to IPS, but overall breaching as to what the top 4 cloud threat vectors are for breaches and misconfigurations. You'll see more DevOps pipeline type of things with weak links and serverless platforms that have vulnerable code. I like to look at this as sometimes it's vulnerable code you put in there yourself, and sometimes it's code you've borrowed. So at every stage of the game, you have to kind of be aware here, because you may have your developers going out and grabbing things that are, from repositories that are open and available where other people can commit to them, meaning they've uploaded them to make your life simple. Your developer goes out and grabs that and then initiates it to you and says, hey boss, I finished this job early, when really he took the code from somewhere else, which is all good and fine. But if you don't check it properly or scan it properly, you might be introducing vulnerabilities into your pipeline or into your production. And you also might be putting vulnerable code out there, or old code that might be vulnerable, which opens up an attack surface you didn't have before. So beyond that, you have misconfigurations. This goes back to speaking to, hey, I'm used to data center, now I've got my guys doing cloud stuff as they're learning to go, or even if they have the experience, it's good to audit as you go. Things like to save lack of validation of your actual conformity scripts, your secrets management, and make sure you're rotating that on a proper basis. Open workloads and storage access, which seems to be a bigger and bigger problem. Your S3 buckets being completely public. So have something that actually goes out there and audits those pieces and makes those things and adjustments for you. So when you apply security, controls matter. So to make this funky graph make more sense, essentially the earlier in the process of the workflow stage, the better it is for you money-wise, less money. So during the planning phase, if you implement your security controls in planning phase, you have a 1x cost. If you go all the way to run and then decide to start worrying about security, you're looking at 30 times cost to actually deal with security issues. So do it at every phase, but do it early. And the earlier you do it, the less money you're going to spend overall for resolutions. This is a good one you can show your boss. So stages of a threat. Again, if you've seen some of our presentations, you might recognize this one, but where it's important is count how many times you see intrusion prevention or IPS or vulnerability protection on this slide. And this applies across the board. Containers, cloud, data center, virtual servers, doesn't really matter. Even applies to your endpoints. So most of the time threats arrive, as we know, by email, and they usually move laterally by network. So at every stage of this, you have to have something that deals with it specifically. As it goes to disk is the pre-execution level. As it gets to execution is a runtime level. And then we have the exfiltration level. So each one of these doesn't have to be our product. Of course, I'm going to be biased, but I'd like you to think about and look at what is out there that provides each one of these pieces you have to worry about, all 4 stages of the attack, if you will, and which pieces and parts you might want to look at as far as modules that work on your behalf to protect you. And if you noticed, entry point and exfiltration both have IPS. I say there's probably some other things in there to think about, because this actually will loop again. So if you are compromised on someone's camping, as they move to the next phase of actually trying to jump around your network, say like WannaCry did, where it looks for a machine that's exploitable and then sends the code over to that to infect it and encrypt it with ransomware, this is where the IPS comes into play again, because now you have one machine that didn't get this protection at one of those levels, it gets infected, it tries to hit another machine. If that machine has a proper host-based IPS running with that particular vulnerability in a protection mode, now you have stopped that threat from moving laterally in your organization. And of course, if you can find a product that has good census and whitelist checking, then the 2 things that usually cause the most false positives, like in the machine learning pieces and behavior analysis, this will cut those false positives way down. So this is kind of an overarching piece if you look at it from a modular perspective, or kind of technologies you might want to look at each level. So you have your pre-deployment side, which is more or less like, think of like your containers and your Git repositories you're pulling in to run your containers. I'm looking to run them from a vulnerability scanning standpoint, like we mentioned earlier. We're going to look for detection as well before you move something to prod. Now we've moved it into runtime because it's in prod. What am I doing on the network side to protect things from hitting that container or hitting that system? Doesn't have to be a container. What are we looking at from logging from a PCI standpoint or a PII standpoint, where we're looking at integrity monitoring and log monitoring, where we're looking at the files and seeing if anything's being changed. And we're also looking at behavior analysis and machine learning on the malware side. So again, IPS front and center. You want to make sure you're not introducing vulnerabilities that make the rest of the stuff have to work harder. So on the runtime side, it's not just the runtime of the operating system. You also, I get asked this a lot, where I have an application container running. I need something that's container aware, don't I? Because I'm protecting the OS and the operating system of the host, and it's in its applications, but I also have a container running, which is acting as its own little, individual piece. So the application running in that container might not be updated and could also be vulnerable. So you want to make sure that you're doing a full stack protection. So if you have containers, know that the applications in them will get outdated if you're running them for a very long time and not updating them, and you're going to make sure, and you want to make sure that you are either updating them or running some kind of IPS that is aware of that container application and protecting it the same way it does the host OS. So ransomware stats. Business victim every 14 seconds. Herchevek Group says next year that'll be every 11 seconds, a whole 3 seconds more, right? So why is this important to the conversation of IPS? Well, kind of like I already touched on the previous slide, a lot of times the malware is used to seek out a vulnerability, go past that vulnerability to put the actual malware on the system to start the ransomware process. So having open vulnerabilities on the desktop and servers is just opening yourself up to a myriad of problems beyond just denial of service and exfiltration of data. It's also a possibility for ransomware drops and things like that. So how does it look over time? The cost of a ransomware for globally has been, over time, you can see 2018 to 20, we've gone from $8 to $20 billion. The average request per incident has gone up as well, almost in equal time of the other stat, to now it's the average time someone has an encryption happen on a ransomware on their system, the request for the Bitcoin comes up at $8,100 on average. So getting more and more expensive per incident. So more costs related to breach. 2019, $2 trillion cost to businesses for cybercrime in general. Projected to be $6 trillion by 2021. Healthcare being the most expensive for the cost of a breach at 6.45 million average. Global average cost of 3.9. So we look at how much healthcare is in its own industry as compared to global, right? And then the US having the highest average of all, we're the most attacked of all at 8.19 million for the cost of retrieval, so, and recovery. So you've probably heard about this in the news, the Zerologon, which is CVE-2020-1472. Microsoft made a patch available in August. Ourselves, we had the patch available prior to that as an IPS rule. So the day Microsoft was able to open up and say, hey, we have a patch available, we already had an IPS rule ready to go to protect our customers. So before it was known, we knew it, but when it was known, we were ready to help our customers with it. Essentially, from a high level, a domain control that has not been patched, anything from 2008 R2 all the way to 2019. The attacker can run a small Python script. I showed it to Eric earlier. He was kind of amazed how few lines of code it takes to do this. Can zero out your admin account, which makes it really easy for them then to change it. And then they own your domain controller and everything about it. So there are exploits and proof of concepts all over the net at various stages. Some are just going to look kind of like a Metasploit view to see if it's exploitable. And some of them actually have full exploit code where they can zero out, pull the hash files down of actual logins, and then make the adjustment changes and reset the password to what they want it to be, and then take over your box. So I encourage you to patch, obviously, if you can, for Zerologon. It's an easy patch, but it's also one of those ones that seems to have been ignored by a lot of folks. The Mercury Hacker Group is actively exploiting it and using it to drop ransomware inside environments. Microsoft has been showing up as seeing this, and some they've actually tweeted about this several times in the past couple of weeks, where they're seeing a little bit more of an uptick now again, now that it's got some press showing that this is another vulnerability that kind of went by the wayside a little bit, and now it's getting a little bit more play. So that's why I thought to mention it here. And also I'm going to demo it in just a second. So it is also being used in conjunction with other services, because domain controllers are usually behind the wall, right? So they're a little harder to get to unless you've already been camping or you're laying in wait, so to speak, inside that network. So one of the ways that they're going about it is obviously sending out phishing stuff that gets them some command and control. So now they can actually sit on your network and do things and hunt out those domain controllers to take them over. And also looking for vulnerable services that might have a backend attached to the domain controller, or at least tell them where the domain controller is to start looking around, something like a SharePoint server. And when they find that, then they go searching for the domain controller and they use the exploit. So patch now, patch often. Probably gonna get some questions again about patching. So why do people not patch? Because a lot of these patches require updates because they make a major change to the system. And they require an update to restart the machine, which when you're in production and you don't have a dev environment to work with at the same time, causes havoc and causes downtime, and people hate downtime, which I completely understand. It also requires testing and regression testing to make sure that this patch is not going to cause more harm than it does good, right? So this is the common meme if I have to restart my computer for this update. With virtual patching with IPS technology that understands that there is a vulnerability on the machine and can protect against it, you can go a little longer between patches because you are technically protected from the exploit of that vulnerability. Still advisable to go in and patch those systems when you can, but if you have something in place to protect you in the meantime, at least you have a little peace of mind on that and you can keep going. So when I say sweep the leg with IPS, my point is you're cheating, right? You can kind of cheat the hacker system. So you're saying, hey, I know I have this vulnerability, so I'm going to cheat rather than patch the system for now. I'm at least going to put my virtual patch in with my IPS and protect the system in the meantime, and give me time to actually work out the patch progression time. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing again. I'm going to go grab the demo. One sec there. So here is what I have. I'm going to show my whole desktop. I have two systems: pen test machine, Windows Server 2012 R2 unpatched. This box is essentially a vanilla server, as if you bought it in 2012 and never patched it. And I have a deep security agent running on it, which is workload security. This is the IP address 192.168.1.165. I have workload security running. Maybe. Took it a second. So this is our workload security, which is going to protect your instances, whether they be anywhere, your house, like me, Amazon, Azure, Google Cloud, your friend's cloud, whatever cloud you have or wherever your server sits. This is your dashboard looking at all the information you have. The computer in question today that we're going to be dealing with is my local domain controller running 2012. It's got a policy for Windows Server 2012 on it. And if we open this up, we'll see that I have couple modules running, but more importantly for this demo, I have the IPS running. But as you notice, I have it in detect mode. So I'm going to do it in detect mode. That way I can actually do the exploit, show you what it looks like. And then I'm going to put it in prevent mode to show you how easy it is with just having an IPS, that you can keep these guys from script kidding you to death with these code pieces. I think it's in here, pretty high in here. Let me show you what it looks like real quick. So here is the net logon elevation of privilege vulnerability. So that's the actual vulnerability right there. You can see it's listed as a critical and set to prevent. If you open it up, if you're tired one night and need to be able to sleep better, you can read the descriptions on what these things are. Or if you really want to know more, you can look at the vulnerability data, exactly what it does, and then you can hit the MITRE data all from here. So the nice thing with this, this IPS from us is you get all this information. So if you're really looking to protect your systems properly, you have a lot of information to work off of. If you're ever curious as to why did they decide to apply that rule automatically to that system? Why did they detect that it was vulnerable to something I don't recognize? You can always open it up and figure out what it is you're looking at. So it is running that one. It is in detect mode. So now we're going to go over here. You'll notice that nothing happens to the server. So if you've never seen this done before on the videos online of some of the other guys that do this stuff that are showing it off, you may think like it's one of those things that blue screens a box or does something fun like that. It doesn't do anything. It leaves you no indication. Like I'm logged into this domain control right now as an admin. I'm just like, doing my daily work. I sit over here and I run this thing. What this does is it actually makes an attempt to do the handshake, and the handshake to establish whether or not it's exploitable. Can it be compromised? And it gives you a successor message. If it can't because you're either patched or because you have something in place protecting you from that vulnerability, the script will break, which is kind of fun to watch because it just blows up. That said, I modified this one because I didn't want it to actually change my password and mess with me. I wanted it to just show the part where it proves it can be done. Eric, did you want me to show them the code? That was kind of fun last time.
Yeah, if it's not going to cause you any legal issues later.
No, nothing I'm doing is illegal so far. I'm attacking my own system. So just to show you how little effort of code has to go into doing something that can majorly wreak havoc on your world. This is the code right here to make that happen. For the Python lovers, it probably makes sense. For you that don't code, it's not a whole lot of work. There's not a whole lot here. You can see it's sending, XOF stuff to the target computer. And then I was showing this to Eric earlier. Half of this code from here on down is just reporting back what it received. Like, is it vulnerable or not vulnerable? So it's probably only a few, maybe 60 or 70 lines of actual code to make this happen, which is kind of scary when you think about it. So let's turn this over to prevent. We'll save that real quick. So this should be getting a new policy. While it's doing that, which takes a couple of seconds, I'll go over here and show you a little bit about what it looks like. So here's your IPS flagging these. Here's when it was in detect mode. I have one over here in prevent mode as well, the same thing. But essentially, here's what you're going to get. You're going to get a elevation. It tells you the actual reason and what rule flagged, what the action was. It reset it. It said no, but we haven't done that part yet. But you'll see in a second. And then the data itself, right? So hey, what computer was affected? What was the vulnerability? All the way down to the number. What was the connection, incoming or outgoing, connection flow? So you've got a lot of information. You've also got this information, like who was it that I need to go beat up now about this? And data. So here's the actual data. So as you notice, the script over there was, chappy-dc was what I ran as the name of the DC. So this is the stream actually coming in, and the bit that fires to let us know that was the actual exploit code. So I think it should have processed by now. So now we're in prevent mode, and it breaks. So the script completely doesn't even get a chance to do anything. As you can see, connection reset by peer. So the attempt to create the handler, which is it's saying this piece here, which is the big part of getting it started in the authentication challenge process to create that back and forth handshake with zeros that kind of freaks out the system and causes the exploit to happen on a high level view of that. It sees that and goes, nope, I'm going to connection reset you, so it kills it. So that is the importance of a host-based IPS. I didn't have to patch that system. Matter of fact, I've never patched this system. Here's a brand new vulnerability that's been out just a few months and keeps getting more and more dangerous as people are adding more and more stuff to it, where it's becoming kind of like the front door. I can go in, hit that domain controller, run this, and then if I can get in, I'm not only going to change the password, I'm going to actually follow that up with more scripts that actually do other things to it, push in droplets, pushing more malware, pushing ransomware stuff that I can throw around your network. So it's pretty dangerous when you can get this level of access to something that important. So simply patch or do the right thing when you have a host-based IPS while you're working on your patch management process.